This is the feast of the Martyrs of the Reformation, attached to Wales specifically. As it happens, there would be fairly close links with some of these geographically, insofar as two of them would have been very local and another two would have been local where I grew up. So let's look at, first of all, those two who were martyred very close to where I used to go to school. It was a moving moment every time I'd go into the Catholic Church, very close to the school where I was growing up, because the stained glass windows of their martyrdom were just as one entered the church, having gone through the porch. It was St. John Lloyd and St. Philip Evans, and they were fairly late in time. In fact, they were only 2 years before the last of all, our local St. Oliver Plunkett here in Ireland, whose head is very close to us here at Drogheda. But of course he was martyred at Tyburn, the last of the great army, as late as 1681. But in 1679, because of the Titus Oates thing, which caused an awful lot of havoc, the so-called Popish plot, which was nothing of the kind, and which turned against Catholics and priests in particular in a very severe way, as late as this period, the end of the 1600s. And so it was involving people not just at Tyburn, but also elsewhere, and therefore Cardiff. Cardiff prison had these in them, and eventually they were hanged, drawn and quartered at the place where now the bank stands. It's the old gallows field, as it was called. And so we know from a true testimony that they were very joyful in the Lord and were not in the least perturbed. They might be privileged to be amongst the army of martyrs. So there they were, these future white-robed martyrs, there in the dark prison of Cardiff. But they had managed to invent some game to pass the time between prayers, and they were playing some kind of tennis inside the cell where they were, and somebody came to the door. It was the authority, and they were being summoned, they were being called, and on the stained glass window it just simply says, "The Call." And so what did they do? Even though this call meant going on the hurgle to be hanged, drawn and quartered for high treason, they calmly replied, "Would you mind if we finish this round first?" And so they did, actually doing what a good Jesuit would do. If the will of God is in that act of the present moment, then one does well that act of the present moment, and in that is one's sanctification. But they also testified to the joy of the Lord, as did the very first ones in that long line of martyrs, the Carthusian martyrs, whom St. Thomas More could see from his prison window, going on the hurdle to the Tyburn tree. And as he said to his daughter Meg, "Look at them, they're going like brides to the wedding feast." And we know that the way in which the Carthusians bore testimony was greatly helped by God. We have that story, which is true, that when they were wanting to know what to answer the High King's officers, they went into chapel and they celebrated the Mass of the Holy Spirit, and tongues of fire appeared over their heads at the consecration and elevation, and they knew that they were going to be given strength and the very words, for they were the first to bear witness to the unchanging truth of the one church founded by Jesus Christ on earth, that no king could alter or remake. So St. John Lloyd in this case, and Philip Evans went to their glory towards the end of this long succession of army soldiers willing to give all to the High King, who deserves the best and no compromise. But there were others way before. The closest to them actually in time is another one operating in the south, St. David Lewis. He, like St. John Roberts, whom I will mention shortly, was actually an Anglican. He was born in Monmouthshire in 1616 of a Protestant father and a Catholic mother. He was educated at Abergavenny Grammar School and at the Middle Temple. In 1635, he joined the household of the Comte Savage as tutor, and there he was received into the Catholic Church. Well, actually, there he got strongly the faith, and he was not received there, but in a safer place, actually outside the country, at Paris. Something similar happened to John Roberts, but I'll come to that in a minute. He soon afterwards entered the English College in Rome, and that English College in Rome is something else. It's the only college that has remained there right in the middle of Rome where it was founded, and it is still very much as it was. And one sees all these portraits of martyrs on the wall. They'd all passed through that place. And indeed, when they were going back to England after being ordained, they would come out, and St. Philip Neri would come out of the church of San Gerolamo, St. Jerome, which is nearly opposite, and he would salute them. I think actually he would, in a gesture of humility, greet them on all fours, as it were. And he would say to them, "Salvete, flores martyrum." Hail, flowers of martyrs, which is the opening line of the hymn to the Holy Innocents. He and they knew what was ahead. Maybe he had a secret envy. Martyrdom is the maximum. And so they went, and of course didn't come back, and they knew exactly what was waiting for them. So we have David Lewis, who is in that place. He was ordained priest in 1642 and became a Jesuit then after ordination in 1644. After his profession, he became spiritual director to the English College, which is interesting. By the way, there is evidence that Shakespeare secretly took refuge for a while in the English College. We have his signature there. We know that William Shakespeare was a crypto-Catholic. He kept a low profile, but we know from hostile contemporary evidence that William died a papist. In the north, of course, there was a resistance. So, he eventually returned to Herefordshire in 1648 and worked there for the rest of his life. Now, bear in mind this little corner of Wales. Welsh was, of course, still spoken, and the names of the places indicate how Welsh it was. And strangely enough, even now, the Archdiocese of Cardiff includes a chunk of Herefordshire, mainly so as to have Belmont Abbey in it. But that's a little parenthesis. However, it's not without historic significance, because that was, with the area around St Winifred's Well in the north, the little enclave of resistance. It was hoodwinked, it was sort of allowed to continue. Officially, nobody knew, but of course everyone knew. So anyway, that's where the Jesuits were being formed, were being corrupted in the eyes of the church of the time. I mean the Anglican Church, created by a king. And so this is why eventually it was fairly easy for the Benedictines to have their house of formation, Belmont, in that area, near Abergavenny. To this day, there's quite a strong Catholic presence down there. So that's where things were going on. He was at Llanorothal as the centre of activity. There was a large farmhouse there, and it was used as a mission centre. Lewis himself was superior twice during his 50 years, or its 50 years of existence as a place of mission and formation. So we have this famous popish plot of Titus Oates. And what happens? The farmhouse is sacked. The library is given to Hereford Cathedral, and Lewis is arrested. He was imprisoned at Monmouth, tried at Usk, and condemned for his priesthood. He rode with John Kemble. And by the way, I think the expression the Kemble pipe comes from him. Wasn't he the one who calmly smoked his last pipe before being hanged, drawn, and quartered? Anyway, he was with this man of God, going to London for questioning, and on his return was executed at Usk on August the 27th. On this occasion, listen to this, the official hangman refused to perform his task and fled. A convict was offered his freedom if he would like to take his place, but he was stoned by the bystanders and likewise fled. A blacksmith was finally induced to carry out the sentence. On the scaffold, Lewis spoke at length in Welsh, summarizing his convictions and describing why he was to suffer. His grave is in Usk to this day and is still visited by pilgrims. So, a parallel is St John Roberts, one of our two local ones in the north. In fact, every month we used to go down to get Lilla down for the Welsh Mass, and there they had a relic, either in that church or in the other church, Dolgellau. You could come and go. And St John Roberts was from Trawsfynydd nearby. He was an Anglican, and he was influenced by a one remaining monk of the nearby abbey. The abbey of the Cistercians is still there in its ruins, and he was happy to be in the company of this monk who really wouldn't abandon altogether ship. And so, in Cymer Abbey, he was being tutored by this monk who had good Latin, and he was also picking things up. He went to Oxford, to St. John's College, where actually I've concelebrated with the then Bishop Edwin Regan in Welsh, in the chapel where he would have prayed while still an Anglican. And then he went to Paris. He was around Notre Dame, and it was in Paris that he was received into the Catholic Church. He had a legal formation, and this came in actually quite useful when it came to defending himself legally, because when eventually he was tracked down, captured, and put in prison, he was trying to use what he knew with regards to getting them to prove that he was a priest. Eventually he declared, "Yes, I am a priest." And so the issue came out clearly, and the reason for his martyrdom. However, before things got to that stage, he'd been very good to people in the area, because in London, he couldn't get as far as Wales, but in London he'd helped in the plague, and he knew the people, and the people knew him and respected him. So when in 1610 he joined the Glorious Army and was carted on the hurdle, bump, 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 on the road, because the body touches the road, to the famous Tyburn tree, which of course had to be expanded. There was room, I think, for 8 at a time to be hanged. Of course, they were taken down, opened up, and the entrails were put in this cauldron. And eventually the quartering was the taking off the head and putting all the rest in bits. So this was the gentle treatment what was awaiting him. But in his case, the part of the ritual, which is the actual moment of death, because they were taken down from the gallows, even though they might have lost consciousness by being strangled on the rope, they did actually have to be brought back to consciousness for the gentle treatment that was going to end them off. And so this was the situation, and part of the ritual was that the heart was pulled out of the body, still beating, and the executioner would hold up this heart, still beating, and declare, "Behold the heart of a traitor." And everyone was expected to reply, "Long live the king!" Or, if it was Elizabeth, "Long live the queen!" In his case, silence. No one dared to say that. In his case, he'd won the respect of all by his self-sacrifice in the plague in London. So, St. John Roberts, he has traces of him still in Downside Abbey. I believe there's a whole arm of his there. We also have the parchment of his vows, his life vows, and it has on it Fray Juan de Menevia, I think, Brother John of Menevia, which is the old title for St. David's, Wales. Or is it Meirionnydd in the north? Doesn't really matter. And I think it is actually. He is there in that form of relics, as are quite a few in Downside, because of the ancient history. Now, Downside, of course, is there because of John Roberts, because what happened? He did not choose the Jesuits, he chose the Benedictines. Now, there was a nucleus there in the area of Valladolid, and these were keen on having a strict life, but there was, despite that great strictness, something in their heart linking them to England still. And in exile they maintained the torch of the Benedictine tradition. He was prior of St. Gregory's in Douai. Now Douai was a great centre of counter-Reformation, of resistance on the continent, and it was linked with Reims, and the Douai-Reims Bible, which was used until basically the Second Vatican Council widely amongst Catholics, was hatched there in that combination of centres. I've actually prayed in the place in Douai where these would have been praying. Still there, it's part of now a college, school. The chapel is there, and one can see how they would have prayed on that high altar, aware of the majesty of God that they were serving, but eventually at great risk. So another centre was Dieulouard, and that's the one that gave the present Ampleforth. And the Ampleforth branch is very much aware of the continuity with the pre-Reformation family of Benedictines, the one that, of course, were at Westminster Abbey since the time of St. Edward the Confessor. Well, the Dieulouard group know how Dom Sigebert Butley handed on the succession to two young men, therefore two postulants who became novices, and he had been a monk of Westminster Abbey and had survived and was able to hang on to his rights as a representative of the English Benedictine congregation, which is a very ancient one. It's called the Venerable One, the Venerable English Congregation, because of its antiquity, and they have specific customs and a specific habit, which is with a very large hood, the elephant ears. And so this carried on, and the direct line would be the Ampleforth one, which when I was being taught by these monks there in my parish, they informed me was something to be proud of. One was aware of this tradition, and they were certainly very much aware of it, and one sensed it. But at that time it was a very large community, 120 monks, and they had parishes as well, including our own. There were 6 monks or so there. But anyway, this was what was going on the continent, and they were educating these young sons of well-to-do Catholics who would just about survive. But these were going to be important, as indeed Ampleforth and Downside are still trying to do that kind of thing by educating people who will have an influence on society eventually. So St. John Roberts came back, and we had this great devotion to him. We would sing a hymn which I had composed to him after the Welsh Mass each time, in English and Welsh, and the power of his prayer was felt. One time, the mother-in-law of Harry, who used to help us a lot, and who had been partly responsible for that church, a lot of the work had been done by him, and this mother-in-law was in great pain, cancer, and there was an awful, awful, unbearable pain, and it was particularly sharp on the area of the leg, and she, in agony, just cried out to Harry, "Harry, do something." And so he had this inspiration to go down to the church and to get the major relic, which they had, of St. John Roberts. He gently prayed and rubbed it against the hurting limb, and from that moment on, there was not one sign of pain. At least, she did not express it. So, these are our friends in heaven. But also, and with regard to that same phenomenon of power in intercession and miracles of healing, we have in our diocese St. Winifred. She was a martyr of virginity, even though it seems that her uncle St. Baynard, who also has his traces in our area, including his thumb mark, because where he signed the treaty with the local landlord, in the stone. He traced his thumb in the stone, and it fits perfectly. If one puts one's thumb there, traces the sign of the cross, it fits perfectly. So that's his thumb trace, and it's now in the Anglican Church of Clonogvawr. From where was St. John Jones. So he also is from our area, and he was one of the great band, one of the 6 who was canonized in 1970 on this day by Blessed Paul VI. Remember, Oliver Plunkett was slightly later, 1975. And by the way, St. John Paul II was present at that canonization. He managed to get out of Poland with a pilgrimage. So, St. Winifred, of course, is far earlier. It seems that she was healed again, she was put back together, as it were, by St. Beno, the abbot of Clonogvawr, because then she went as a nun, I think, to Gwytherin, and there she lived a hidden life. But the well still gushes forth, and water still gushes forth to this day and does miracles. And in fact, there are graffiti from the high points of penal times there. One can see the dates. So they were being healed, and the authorities couldn't actually stop it. And Anglicans would go there, because anyone who wants healing will do anything, and they would be healed. And they would go away and say to each other, "Oh, what wonderful water." I was there in 1990 or so, and I took the water. One goes in 3 times, it's ice cold, and one asks for the graces that one wants, and I was deeply moved by the power of that water, and I composed a hymn, and I think it's still in the archives of the sanctuary there, actually, because I sent it off to them and they put it in the archives straight away. So this, it also went round, actually, strangely enough, the Baptist newspaper, and because it was partly in Welsh, and a letter came back from Wales. I was by that time a novice here in Ireland, and this letter came from the wife of a good minister I know, and he'd be fairly evangelical now, Baptist, but fairly evangelical Baptist, but his wife had fairly bad pains, arthritic pains, and she was moved by this hymn and this testimony I'd given in this paper, and she, without telling her husband, went to the Holy Well and took the water, and she was so moved by the healing that came that she sent a generous cheque to me there as a novice, and was moved by how ecumenical these saints could be. And so was I, because it does show that on the other side there's a way of seeing things amongst the saints which is interesting. A huge generosity there. And the son of that same Harry I mentioned had a similar experience, because his girlfriend Maggie, they went down to Mount Melleray one time. They were on holiday, and there is holy water there as well in the grotto where it would seem Our Lady had been doing things and appearing. And he said to his girlfriend in Welsh, "Rhod the law and vanna," because she had this huge wart or whatever it was. There was something on her skin and it was worrying. So he said, just in Welsh, to put her hand in there. And she did, and she even made the sign of the cross, actually, even though she was a good Methodist, and very piously, and it disappeared. That is interesting. These saints are very homely. St. Winifred. Lines written in student days. After bathing completely 3 times in the ice-cold water that ever since they gushed forth where the martyr's head fell, have produced miracles all through the centuries to this day. O gentle maid, white virgin of a day, that marked all days to come, Thou too didst know the treading of a way, found hard at times by some. Thou too didst know well what 'tis to burn, but couldst not be aglow by halves, by quarters, that could this flame turn on more than one, or show what 'twas to love, ere love thou hadst become. Love hadst become, love hadst become. Forwinning vathal voin baby ost kind, en dan dros Christe hin, agwen flam oes der oud aus rybeth hind, wrth gan in ma bydyn. Tibi ost fodlon yng ngharwriaeth lem, ac alon na fi'n roi, I fwy nag un na bwrw et oeth rem, ar eilin a faint troi, e gremodd I ar y gwrthrych mwyaf un, mwyaf un, mwyaf un. And so, this goes on. And when at one time there was a harsh feeling towards St. Winifred and the place where these things were going on, some local activists came along and chopped off the head of St. Winifred from the statue. I understand that 3 days later, mysteriously, but not under any human hand, something went wrong and they all were dead. Interesting. So, life has gone on, and to this day, miracles are happening quite a lot at St. Winifred's Well. People who can't conceive are able to conceive quite often after taking the water and obtaining that grace through St. Winifred's intercession. Even the young Princess Victoria went there before she became queen. Healing, I suppose, is something that man always wants when he's down. And he's not too fussy, I suppose, about where it's coming from, which of course is dangerous as well, as we know from New Age. But this is the real thing. These saints are close to the maximum. The martyrs in particular died on the cross. And there's a configuration between the moment of death of a martyr and that of the consummatum est of the Lord on the cross. So we see how, when it comes to glory, they have power. It's only a few weeks since Father Jacques de Hamel was martyred in his robes at the altar, very close to the sacrifice of the Lamb himself. And he did say, as he looked into the face of the one who was about to martyr him ritually, not addressing him, but the power pushing him, Va-t'en, Satan, va-t'en, Satan. Satan, be gone. Satan, be gone. Ova bintira tadinta dani, agobin orvanas goviadi, agloing grimid andon by therois, aurendius tega canary by the rois, e mine amavine bedrotle behoin, agras legi Adeliaist wide aroin, a glowy o nam naira berthe, rione with one, win rio gavar with way. I make a little jump to the area where our family farm would be. It's in Powys, Montgomeryshire. There is another link with the band. It's Richard Gwynne. It's fairly early on in time. He was a schoolmaster and very much loved. A layperson, therefore, and also a poet. We have the ballads of Richard Gwynne. Gwynne means white. And he was at one stage tempted to conform exteriorly, and he prayed that maybe God could make the celebrant a valid priest, at least for that celebration, it would seem. But anyway, he wasn't too happy about what he was doing, and something strange happened when he came out of church. He was pecked at horribly by two ghastly ravens, aiming at the very part which contained the particle that he had received from the Anglican clergyman, right there at his stomach. And it was something which got at him with great violence all the way between church and home. So never again did he go to the Anglican celebration. He knew that there was something missing. Eventually, he too was hanged, drawn and quartered. And as he saw his heart coming out, he said in Welsh, O Dduw Gwyn, pa beth ydy hyn, O white God, that means, O blessed God, what thing is this? And it was replied to him in English, it is the execution of the High King. So he, I believe, was the first of the series of the 6 Welsh ones to enter into glory. And by the way, he was so popular that in his case too, they had a great job to find anyone to make the gallows, the rickety scaffold, and eventually somebody had to be found who was not competent. But who can be competent when it comes to execution? However, there was great ingenuity in trying in the meantime to get information, and we know that the Jesuits particularly were hunted because it was a whole underground network. One of the great ones was Edmund Campion, and we know how well hidden they were. These hidey holes made by Brother Little John, Nicholas Owen, were works of art, and they're so well made that probably they will never ever be discovered, some of them. They're so hidden. And so they tried to find him, and they looked everywhere and everywhere and everywhere, and eventually they were giving up. They just could not find him. They left, but they had one last look back, and the leader of the squadron said, we couldn't actually see what was between that point and that point. Let's go back. And so they hacked and knocked, and they found him. Ah, a great booty. And so they tried to extract information. This was a naturally open and communicative man, and it may be because of this and the familiarity of constant danger that he became lax after a year of disguises, hidings out, impersonations, close calls, and furtive journeys. He was captured at Lyford Grange, a Catholic house, by George Eliot. Eliot had been a servant in 2 Catholic households, and when he was jailed for rape and homicide, he won his freedom by informing on the religious practices of his former employers. The government often employed such trash as priest hunters. Through servants he knew at Lyford, he got himself invited to Father Campion's Mass and listened to his sermon on a text of the day, and Christ wept for Jerusalem. Which the saint applied to the present state of England. The recusants present remembered this sermon as the prelude to St. Edmund's own passion. Eliot left as soon as he unobtrusively could, and with the nearest magistrate surrounded the house with armed men. The search lasted almost 24 hours. So eventually they turned back and they looked and they got him between those two parts which they hadn't been able to get through to. 4 days later he was taken without warning up the Thames to Leicester House, where Queen Elizabeth was visiting the Earl. After a brief interview they came to the point. Splendid appointments in the Anglican Church were awaiting him if he would abjure his faith publicly. He declined. 5 days later, the Earl of Leicester, his former patron, authorised Campion's torture. From July through to November, he was put to the rack 3 times. The rack was a rectangular frame in which the prisoner was laid. His wrists and ankles were fastened at either end, and then he was stretched by means of a winch, so that his body was sometimes suspended in air. The effect was to pull his arms and legs out of joint, tear the wrists and ankles, and make respiration difficult. The pain was excruciating. Strong men fainted at the sight of the machine. Campion confided to someone that during his 3rd bout on the rack, he thought they had decided to execute him by means of it. Their purpose was to get from him sensational tales of Spanish gold to foment rebellion and audacious plots to murder the Queen. Nothing of the sort was forthcoming, of course, and although they managed to piece together some bits of his itinerary of the past year, it was clear that he never broke down, never blurted out what they wanted to hear, never lost his old inflexible constancy. This, then, was Edmund Campion, one of the bright lights of Europe, victim of what basically was at work. Extinguish the means of grace in England, Our Lady's dowry. And what happened in Wales was they died of anemia. They couldn't get back to Wales. The priests, except for that tiny enclave down there in the southeast and what was going on at the area of Holywell, the priests could not minister to the people who, with time, had nothing else but what was being offered to them. The system set up by not Christ the Lord, but a king and a queen who were basically playing the game of the enemy of the soul. Child of all land, the chaste father overthrown, dost thou this night recall to whom belong these parts of us that once to heaven were wed, these silent choirs where once thy feet did tread? Dost thou still hear the echo of this pause in ancient song that long flowed 'tween the pores of heavy stone, where buried lies a while a patient spring, an old familiar smile?